All right. That cracked me up when I made it, and I was like, surely I will play this one time and we will never use this again. And now I can't believe it.
It's so good. I look forward to it every time.
All right. Well, welcome to an exciting edition of the Aspire Community Stand-Up. We're joined by a remote correspondent broadcasting live from London.
Yeah.
Woo!
From a hotel room, as you can tell by my beautiful decor. I'm Maddy. Yeah. I'm here for NDC. And then today we also had a meeting in the office with a bunch of customers of Microsoft and or Azure, and we talked to them about stuff. And yesterday I was in Amsterdam for literally 24 hours to talk to a different customer.
Wow.
And I'm not asleep yet. I also just found out that there's a Din Tai Fung in London, which I did not know. So that is what I will be doing after this. So I'm very excited.
Very good.
Wonderful.
Yep. Anyways. And then less remote, but still technically remote, we have
Damian.
Oh, hi. I was like, where is she gesturing to? Is someone else there in the room with her? I was like, wait, no, but she said remote. Yeah, hello everyone. It's me. It's Damian. We're gonna talk about Aspire stuff.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, I will start with our one community link, the slightly spicy link suggested by Maddy. Okay. And it is, if I can, okay. So let's talk about this one here. If I go, boom, add to stage. Okay. So there was, I'm sure, it's funny, like things keep coming back around, keep getting the same kinds of questions, but it's an interesting discussion. So this thing, I actually did consider sharing this earlier. And I'm like, I don't know. Then Maddy's like, yeah, go for it. So it's a very quick one. Docker Compose versus .NET Aspire. I think I read this before you left. Very good answer here, right? Like, so
my novel. This is honestly the reason I wanted to bring this up is because I don't know, a year ago, shortly after Aspire was announced, the same kind of post would come up all the time, and people would all just be like, yeah, I don't know. But when this one showed up last week, we were looking in the comments and people were correcting people correctly. And we were like, oh my gosh, people are actually getting it. So, we were reading through and we were like, oh, that person said the right thing. Or like, oh, like Fowler didn't even have to come in here and correct things. Like, this is great. And so, and for those of you who have been hands-on with Aspire, it's kind of like Docker Compose ++, and then other stuff. But for a while too, there was a period of time where people thought that you could not use Aspire if you weren't using the deployment stuff. And so we almost over pivoted the messaging, I guess, because now people are like, it's just Docker Compose. And we're like, wait, no, back in the middle. But that made me very happy to see this. I was like, okay, community's catching up. I'm very proud mom. So
cool. Yeah. It's the joke lately people say is like, if you want the answer to something, you put the word Reddit at the end. It's funny. Reddit can be all over the place, but it is nice when there is a productive discussion.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. I think we've reached it's always a point in a new thing's maturity when you've got folks from the community who can jump in and, as Maddy said, correctly answer correctly. Or at least offer, some informed viewpoint that actually aligns with what we think it is too. Because for the first year, we were kind of figuring it out ourselves. The reality is there's no clean analogy for Aspire. There's not like we can say it's like X and it covers everything. It's like it's for Uber for .NET. Because Docker Compose is underselling it as a .NET dev, right? Like if you want to run your .NET apps locally during the inner loop, with Docker Compose, that's like a whole other thing. Like you have to publish to a Docker container to get it run into Docker Compose, which is typically not part of your inner loop experience when you're doing .NET development on a project, right? You might create a Docker container as part of your publishing pipeline, but not typically while you're like editing the project, like working on it. Generally. So then, that coupled with our integration testing features, which are sort of only new, and that's an area we want to focus on, which we'll talk about, coupled with the deployment stuff that Maddy talked about, which we've also got big plans for this year. And obviously the tooling integration, just the ability to hit F5 and have everything spin up in VS or C# Dev Kit and have the debugger attached to not just one project, but like all of the projects. And again, that's just the beginning. Like we have aspirations to do a lot more than that. Like we have have that type of flow where you're launching and then debugging code, not just be C# when you use Aspire. Like we have great polyglot coding experiences, especially in VS Code. And we would love to see something like, hey, yeah, my Node app and my .NET app are both composed into this Aspire app host project, and I hit F5 and the JavaScript debugger or the TypeScript debugger attaches to the Node app after it's launched by Aspire, as well as the C# debugger being attached, and repeat for other languages as necessary. We've done the first round of integrations for those type of things today in terms of at least adding it and then running it. And then we've got some examples floating around of how you can streamline kind of the acquisition experience. So like for Python, I've been quite vocal publicly about all my pains in trying to get Python apps to work because I'm not a Python dev. And if I have to like integrate or run something that's Python, the first step is usually, well, which Python?
Yeah.
Because no matter what the doc says, if I install like the latest version and I say, yeah, that's greater than the version that you said you needed. And it's like, yeah, but that one looks like it has a problem with this specific pip thing. So don't use that version, use this other version. It's like, oh, okay. And then pick your package manager. Let me just rail on Python for a second. So like, but there are opportunities to improve that. So like in the Aspire samples repo, I think we took one approach where I use MS Build integration. So when you build the app host, the Node app and the Python app both restore their respective packages using npm and pip in those cases. But there's another school of thought that perhaps we shouldn't do it during there. We should do it when you run the app hosts as part of like making sure that those projects that you've added or those apps that you've added in your app host are ready to go. And then there's like a step further, which is what if you didn't even need to install Node and Python? Like we just did it for you, or we defaulted if you don't have them to running in a container. And so in the Aspire, in the eShop, what's that one called? eShop, not backend. Is that what it is? It is eShop backend.
eShop backend? eShop support?
It's that one, eShop support. That's the one I'm talking
eShop
about.
support, yeah.
Yeah, so in the eShop support repo, we had a branch. I'm not sure if it's merged yet, but when we were updating it to Aspire 9, we moved the Python app into a container, even for local inner loop dev. And that just removes all the acquisition problems. So it's just like, yeah, like you use Docker and containers for what they're great at, which is just give me all the stuff I need to run without me having to worry about like acquiring that stuff manually. But we still set it up so it's optimized for inner loop. So like you bind mount the files from the source machine into the container. So hot reload still works because the process that's running inside the container that's watching for file changes, which I think it's using UV. No, it's using a different Python server. I can't remember which one it was. But because they're bind mounted to the host, it still works. And so you can still like edit your Python files in your editor and it still reloads the app automatically over in the container. So there's really interesting kind of workflows you can get going with. And it's all just like writing a bit of C# to bootstrap that over on the app host side and a little bit of, Docker file stuff, which I use Copilot to help me. Because again, I was a complete Python noob. So like, hey, Copilot, can you help me like write a Docker file for a Python app that has all these facets? And 10 minutes later, we figured it all out. So there's lots of different approaches. And we're one of the things we want to be able to do, this is a good tangent that I took myself on. One of the things we want to do is look at this in a little more depth at some point when we get some of our more fundamental stuff baked. So.
Now, did you mention you looked at using CSnakes with any of that, or?
I did not. So CSnakes, for those who don't know, I haven't looked at it in anger at all yet. So CSnakes is like this new approach to integrate Python with .NET. And my understanding is it uses source generators to actually effectively map or project, like a bit like when, I don't know, folks who ever used WinRT to C# projections, or if you've ever used like ComInterop, where the APIs available to you in the other environment get kind of projected into the .NET, into your .NET code so that you can just call methods as if they were .NET methods. And this is what CSnake is doing, but it's using more modern approaches, aka source generators. So rather than using like runtime interop or some other type of generated assembly approach like the com stuff used to do. It's just using source-based generators now. So it's pretty cool from what I understand. And so like you can have your Python app with a bunch of methods, or again, I don't know anything about Python. So what do you do? Like export modules? Like I have no idea what the naming is. Is that right, Maddie? Is it a
Yes,
module
that's
export?
exactly it. Look at
Right.
you.
So you export a module and that will have methods or functions or members or whatever they call them in Python on it. And then they become APIs you can call in C#. They just look like any other .NET APIs. I guess it's a little similar to like how in Blazor you can do JavaScript interop, except we don't generate methods over there. You have to know the method name, you pass it as a string, you pass args in, but then we do like the interop, like we tunnel it and send it across the other side. Very similar idea, right? Or .NET remoting back in the day.
Yeah, we do with a lot of the mobile stuff too, to the native.
Yeah,
platform.
of course. Yeah, Maddie would know all about this stuff. This is like bread and butter for doing mobile dev, right? Because you are totally reliant on the underlying platform.
Okay, well, since you mentioned it, I was playing over the holidays, as you do, with trying to write a Blazor hybrid app and with OpenAI and GitHub models and stuff. And then I was like, oh, I'll use Aspire. And then I went down the little road of like Aspire with Maui is a little complicated right now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a couple, I think there's like 3 or 4 things that have to happen for it to light up. One is when you are building a Maui app, the Maui app builder pattern is not the one that Aspire uses. It's their own version. It's not just iHost application builder. Mm-hmm. So Maui has to interface that and then, actually implement some of those things. That PR is up. It's been kind of just like being cooked on slowly for a while. The more people that go yell about it, the faster it'll go. And then there's the actual IDE stuff. So when you launch it, you need to be able to tell Aspire, launch the dashboard here, and then launch my Maui app for this platform on this emulator. Or maybe that's something we should do from the dashboard now that we have stop and restart, but like that's a decision we have to make. And then there's, of course, the service defaults and everything. So it's not a service, it's a client. So Damian has a good sample of like client defaults with WPF or WinForms or whatever he did. But a very similar concept like that for Maui. And then, of course, just making sure that all of it actually lights up in the dashboard. And so what you can do now, that's what I do, is I just grab the port. Like with Aspire, since you can run it kind of ephemerally, that's not the word I want, but you know what I mean? Like you can run it now and not have to tear it down every time you want to change something.
Oh, right.
Because of the persistent containers, stop and restart and all that. So what I'll do is I'll just run Aspire and copy the local host for the port that it assigns, or I'll hardwire the port for specifically the one API that I know the mobile is going to have to go to. Sometimes I make one API for mobile, and then that actually talks to everything else. It's just literally just like a router. So that makes my life easier. And by I do this, I mean I've attempted it. I've seen that it worked, and then I was like, cool, never doing that again. But it did work.
It's worth me. I mean, I think this is an interesting example of how, we've said and we aspire to be like, God, I gotta stop doing that. To be really open, like the extending Aspire typically, like whether you're writing a hosting integration or a client integration, you're just writing C#, right, and creating a package if you want to ship it. But where that kind of stops or wraps a container or something is things that have a rich IDE or deep IDE experience, especially around compiling, launching, and debugging. Typically in Visual Studio, that stuff is very baked into the project system for that specific project type. And so you don't, just lighting that up in Aspire is actually incredibly complicated from our side, just because like the way those things work in VS, they're literally shipped and built by different teams. And we can't just like bring them together and make them all work. It's just not that straightforward. And so the first place this showed up, and to this day, is still like web stuff. So when you launch an ASP.NET Core app or other web apps in Visual Studio today, you may notice that there are options for what browser to launch. So it finds all the browsers on your machine, and you can choose which browser you want to launch as well as things like if you've got more advanced scenarios, like your web project is multi-targeted between multiple .NET runtimes, you can choose which one you want to launch under. A lot of that stuff is actually encapsulated in the web project system. It's like a part of Visual Studio that specifically loads ASP.NET Core projects. So when you launch an Aspire app host project, it is not a web project. It doesn't use the web SDK. You're not writing web code in that project. You don't have Razor files and CSS and other types of web things. You write C# to describe your application. It's an app host project. But when you launch it, it opens a browser because we put the dashboard in there. But the dashboard isn't a web app that you're working on. There's no source for it in the app host. It's just a package reference, and inside of that is an executable. It's like it's been compiled already, right? So it's like shipping. It's like you've published your web app. And so we did the work to wire up the browser launch feature for the app host and to wire just that URL through. But we don't expose all of the which browser do you want to launch in thing, because that's like a whole other feature of the web project system that doesn't have a clean mapping. And so that's just like one example. And then you add things like Blazor WebAssembly, which has an entirely different build pipeline and debugging infrastructure, because it has to attach to like the browser and do debugging. It's more like JavaScript debugging. And so you want, hey, if you might notice right now, if you add a Blazor WebAssembly project to an Aspire app host project as a reference and then launch it, it's a little bit different. Like what happens is you get two browsers getting launched. Like the WebAssembly project will launch anyway, even though you've added it via an app host. And for other web projects, we don't do that. We just launch the dashboard. And then we assume you're going to click the link in the dashboard to launch a new tab in that one browser, rather than lots of browser windows opening for every web project. But that's kind of a wrinkle with our Blazor WebAssembly experience right now. And that's another example of this integration issue in Visual Studio. And then Maui is yet another example, which has very complicated and specific needs with regards to what does it mean when I build and run a Maui app? Well, I don't know, like you're going to run on an Android emulator? Are you going to run on a iOS remote device or an iPad? Are you going to run a Windows desktop app because you're doing Windows hosted Maui? Is it Blazor hybrid? Like there's so many different scenarios, and they all have different code to handle them in the Maui project system, which it lives in Visual Studio. And then conversely, there's a Maui extension for VS Code as well, and there's some of that stuff is shared there. So getting all that to work in the context of I just want to launch my app host and it happens to reference a Maui, and then I want all that stuff to be exposed, is like a whole bunch of decisions and work that we would need to do, and it just hasn't sort of bubbled to the top of the priority yet. And so typically when we say extending Aspire, it's usually really straightforward. Just add a hosting integration that wraps a container or some tool chain. If you want to integrate Java or something, like Aspire Community Toolkit has lots of other language stacks that have been integrated in as hosting integrations, or a client integration to bring into your Aspire sort of .NET client apps, which can be services or web projects or whatever. That's just code. Like that's just C#, not a problem at all. But the stuff where you want the F5 inner loop experience to like get the best of all the things, like we have to typically do explicit work in either Visual Studio or C# DevKit / VS Code to get those things to work seamlessly. And that, full circle back to the comments I was making about Polyglot. Yeah, attaching the node debugger when you launch an Angular app that you've brought in or you're launching from your app host, that's something that we kind of have to enable to get that seamless F5 experience that we would like to be able to deliver. So those are things we've talked about, we think about. They're just not at the top of the kind of priority list yet.
Yeah. It's interesting as you talk it through. It's like, oh yeah, I didn't connect that. There are all those things that are already existing and in place and may not have ever thought to expose that kind of information both ways.
Yeah, especially because in the case of Aspire, it's not just about launching 5 different projects, which you can do in VS, right? Multi-project solution launch is a thing. It's Aspire is controlling them in some sense. It's configuring them. So like when you write the code in your app host project to say, hey, I want one of these projects and I want it to reference this other project, like say a database or a web service, we inject configuration when that's launched so that the right port, to Maddy's point she made before, is injected in and configured correctly. But we just do it with environment variables. Like Android emulator apps like don't really flow environment variables from the Windows host machine all the way through into the Android app that's running inside an emulator, as far as I know.
Yeah, you have
so
to send
if we wanted that to work, we'd have to do a thing, right? Invent something else.
So it's like you have to pass it through as a launch argument, and then you still have to do some form of proxying or whatever to get the Android local host to the local host on your machine and not the local host on the emulator. It's a whole thing. It's a whole thing. And that's similar to what we had to do for different container runtimes, where you have to use different host names to communicate across the boundaries. So if you've got a process running on your host machine that wants to talk to a process running in a Docker container,
or vice versa, or a process in one Docker container or one container talking to another container, depending on what container runtime you're using, that host name can be different. It's not all just local host anymore because they're different like virtual hosts. And so you have like this, host.docker sort of domain, and there's a podman version, whatever. So we have to track all that inside the app host, inside Aspire, so that we can inject the right configuration. And we still have some edge cases where things don't work quite as well because people, for example, don't use Docker Desktop. So Docker Desktop does like a whole bunch of magic when you run on Windows to make it kind of like work somewhat seamlessly for a lot of these scenarios, and other container runtimes don't necessarily do some of the same things. And so handling all those convoluted kind of networking issues is another thing we've talked about quite a lot, and we're still working on ways to improve, along with the whole lifetime management of containers, which is a huge, turns out, one of our biggest headaches so far. We're going to be making big improvements on that in Aspire 9.1. In Aspire 9.0, we introduced, we automatically create a container network for every app host. So when you launch, all the containers that are inside your app host or defined there get added to the same container network so they can actually see each other, because that wasn't a given, again, if you weren't using Docker Desktop. But we had some issues whereby sometimes they're not always removed. So if you shut down the app host, or you're running in the context of a test and then the test crashes, which happens, those things wouldn't always get cleaned up. And so we've been doing a lot of work in Aspire 9.1, which will be coming out next month, to clean up that scenario. So the way it presents right now is really not great. If you've hit this issue, it'll be that you just go to run your Aspire app one day and like nothing starts. Like none of the containers will start. They just like get to the I'm about to start situation and they just do nothing. And then if you go and run the Docker command to look at all your networks, you'll see this huge list of like Docker networks with Aspire in their name. And that's like, yeah, those are ours. And they're all these, they're like orphaned networks. And so you hit a limit and then Docker's like, I'm not creating any more networks. You've got enough. Sorry. Wow. And so then you have to prune them manually. So we're working, as I said, we've been working really hard on fixing that issue, and hopefully that'll be cleared up for Aspire 9.1.
Okay. Well, we've got some good questions in. I remember we did bill this as a Q&A. So let's start with this. So Joran's saying, in our company, we're limited to using .NET 8 LTS. .NET Aspire 9 is supported on .NET 8. Does that mean no .NET 9 NuGet runtime dependencies anywhere? Like, can you talk a little more about
this? Is an incredibly complicated question. If you want to get into it, so I'll do my best, because this is something that this harks back to a lot of issues and decisions we made at the very beginning of .NET Core, and then we made in .NET Core 2 and 3. So the short answer is Aspire 9 is supported on .NET 8. We very purposely made the decision that Aspire is what we call an out-of-band product. It doesn't ship in .NET. You have to go and get it separately. And we changed from how between Aspire 8 and 9 how we did that. We used to be a workload, and now we're just packages, right? And so because we're just packages, we have to make a choice as the package authors, what version of .NET do these packages require? And so we consciously said that we want the latest version of Aspire to work on the latest LTS, because we know that a lot of customers try to stick or have chosen to stick to the LTS releases because of their longer support lifecycle.
Especially probably with a distributed app where it can be more complicated to upgrade everything, right?
Maybe, yeah, yes and no. I've seen arguments both ways that are completely valid, where people, it's a non-distributed app, and that's why they need to run it. Because it's embedded on some device and they don't get to update it very often, right? Versus distributed apps, which you control the service for, you could update every day. Like, it just depends. Like, different people have different processes. So yes, it is supported, and that means that our baseline version that we target for Aspire 9.x, like any of the Aspire 9 point releases, is .NET 8. You do not need .NET 9 to use Aspire 9. Where it gets more interesting, though, is because we're packages, we reference all the other parts of .NET that we rely on that aren't encapsulated in the TFM, the target framework, by package references. And some of those things are things that also ship in a package in a framework reference. So here's an example: system text JSON, the newish JSON API for .NET. You get that automatically when you target .NET 8 or .NET 9, right? It's just part of .NET. You don't have to have a package reference. You just get it, right? but it also ships as a package as well,
Mm.
because you can use system text JSON on .NET Framework or .NET Standard compliant runtimes, right? It also allows you to use newer features of system text JSON before they've been added to the version of .NET that you run on. So in .NET 9, there were the new features added to system text JSON. They shipped in .NET 9. So your console app that targets .NET 9, you get that. But they also shipped in the system text JSON package in the version 9.0 and above. That version 9.0 of system text JSON can run on .NET 8 because that package targets .NET Standard, so it can run anywhere that you can on .NET Standard because the functionality of system text JSON is built such that it can do that. So if you're on .NET 8 and you get system text JSON by default, but then you add the system text JSON 9 package to get the new features, what version are you now using and what does that mean for support, which is what this question is really getting at. And that's where it gets complicated right now. And we're actually going through a discussion on the team right now to visit this because Aspire in particular has raised this sort of new category of issue because Aspire has lots of external dependencies. System text JSON is just the one that I chose, but we depend on lots of external stuff that isn't controlled by Microsoft, whether it be client libraries for certain packages or things like OTel, which has gone like from 1.9 to 1.10 to 1.11. And those packages make decisions about what packages they bring in, including things like system text JSON, Microsoft.extensions.something. There's a whole bunch of packages there. And whatever those depend on will now get lifted into your project, your Aspire App Host project or your ASP.NET Core project, if anything that you reference pulls them in via the graph. And so what you get into a situation right now, which we're kind of acknowledging isn't great, is that you can be on your .NET 8 app and something you reference pulls in a .NET 9 package. So for example, OpenTelemetry, when they went from version 1.9 to 1.10, lifted all the versions of the Microsoft extension packages they used to the 9 versions, the 9.0 versions, which run on .NET 8. But the 9.0 versions will no longer be patched when .NET 9 goes out of support, which means that if you looked at your full dependency graph now, you've got things in there that will go out of support before the version of .NET 8 that you're running on. That's where people rightly get confused and they want clarity about what does that mean exactly? Does that mean that I've now got things that won't get like security fixes, even though the runtime I'm running on will get security fixes? And why that's particularly, I think, concerning is that it means that sometimes newer isn't better from the point of view of how long is my support lifecycle. And so what we did in Aspire is we tried very hard. We basically do what we call TFM splitting. So our packages target .NET 8, but they target .NET 9 as well. They multi-target. And they bring in different versions of the packages depending on what target framework you're running on. So if you're targeting .NET 8 and you use an Aspire 9 package, we see that and we structured the package such that when you're on .NET 8, we try to bring in the .NET 8 version of the packages as much as we possibly can. But for things like OpenTelemetry, now we're kind of in a hard situation. It's like, well, if we want the new features of OpenTelemetry 1.10, they didn't do that TFM splitting. And I'm just picking OpenTelemetry as an example, but you can pick any of the third-party packages that we depend on. If they don't do that same thing, which hasn't been the strong guidance from us to date, then doesn't matter. Like we have to make a choice now. Do we want the new features of that thing, or do we want to keep people in a situation where they're only running on the version of the package that matches the support lifecycle of the version of .NET they're running on? So this is a complex problem. We're going through a bunch of proposals internally right now to figure out what we might do. We haven't got anything to share at this point, but we're aware of the issue. Aspire has done this work that I talked about to try and keep you on the right, the lowest supported version, so it kind of lines up with your target framework that you've chosen. And that means in some cases we're not pulling in new features. So for OpenTelemetry, we chose not to upgrade our dependency past 1.9 if you're targeting .NET 8, because we knew that would kind of pull you out of that supported that nice circle of stuff that is all on that version. And we're talking about policy changes, technical changes that we could potentially implement to improve this situation. That's a long answer, but it's a very complicated topic. So
Okay. I had no idea I was picking a tough question. I was like, oh, this will be easy.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
here's one.
I gotta
I'm
go,
going to
by
try
the
and
way.
answer this.
So I'll see you guys. Thanks for having
Yeah,
me.
Maddy, thanks for joining.
Yeah.
See ya. I'll be in the
Bye,
chat.
London. Okay. Okay. I'll try and see if I answer this question correctly. Given all this, why not just make everything LTS? In practice, there's no difference in quality between LTS and SDS, as far as I understand, but companies gravitate towards LTS. My understanding, what I've heard is, it's just a simple question of like, how much code we have to support. So if we're doing LTS, that's this many more releases need to be supported for this many more years, and it just adds up. It's a limit.
It's cost. That's the really short answer, is it's cost. Making everything LTS would mean every major release we do is supported for 3 years, which means that we're now in the worst case scenario having to simultaneously patch and support 3 years worth of releases, like 3 different major versions worth of releases, which means it's just a whole other set of stuff that we have to build and support. Now, the thing that I think, even with that answer, I think a lot of people are probably like, I don't get it. Like, how is it more costly? Like, it's just another version. What people perhaps don't appreciate, and I will attempt to explain, is that the cost for us, like the amount of work that has to be done to create something by Microsoft, shipped by Microsoft as an official release, we have a large compliance cost. So unlike, my personal open source packages that I build as Damian Edwards and ship to NuGet.org under the Damian Edwards account, my cost is whatever I choose to support, right? I don't have to go through, I may not localize all my exception messages or strings in my assemblies, because that's a cost, and I don't want to go through the time to do so, right? I just make a conscious choice. I may not, if I ship UI, I may choose not to go through the full accessibility suite of stuff, because that's a whole bunch of work. Security analysis, legal code scrubbing to ensure that any code that's brought in, we know the full provenance of, and all the rest of it. Like, there is like a huge checklist of stuff that any code that gets shipped by us has to go through. And it's not just a checklist that we manually have to do. There are systems that we have to onboard the code and tool chains and build pipelines and release pipelines onto, and they all have incremental cost, in the sense of sometimes it is real monetary cost in terms of internal billing. Other times it is like, you're going to need a quarter of a headcount to manage any new product that you want to ship publicly as an official release, because that's what it is. That is the policy inside Microsoft with regards to if you're going to ship software. So it's a complicated trade-off analysis. It's like, we just have to pick like these sweet spots. So that's, again, the long answer as to why don't we just make everything LTS, because it would cost more. And
I think too, as you pointed out, there's the interdependencies between things. So it's like, okay, this version of the .NET SDK launched by, or interacting with this version of Visual Studio, and maybe, with this browser on this version of Mac OS. Like, it's just,
that's a really good point. It increases what we call like the combinatorial matrix of what is supported. So if there are now 3 long-term support releases that could be active at any point in time, we now have to really understand and make sure that we communicate clearly, to your point. What does that mean with regards to Visual Studio? Does that mean that the Visual Studio from 2 years ago has to support the latest LTS, and vice versa? Like that all tooling and tooling support is something we work really hard to make sure we don't break. So you can always use the latest tools and still work on the oldest stuff. And that's true almost always. The other way typically isn't true. You can't use older tools to use the newer stuff. You have to get the newer tools to use the newer stuff. But it's still complicated. What does it mean to use, to your point? Well, and then it complicates the ecosystem. So the point I just made for the previous question, now package authors have to think about, so now there's 3 active LTSs I need to think about. Should I just target the lowest one all the time? But what if I want the new features? We think the trade-off, like usually the counter answer to that is, well, then make everything LTS, but don't ship every year. Just do less releases. But now you're trading off the ability for us to get new features out into the hands of the customers who can adopt them and want to be able to leverage them to get value out of them, in order to to not have a short-term or a standard term support cycle. So it's all trade-offs. And the one that we landed on, that we saw a lot of other platforms land on, is that you have two trains. You have a standard term and a long term, and the long-term ones are supported longer than the standard term. And that's just kind of where the industry was when we made that choice, and to some extent is still there to this day for at least a lot of other stacks. And so I'm not saying it's not going to change, but that's kind of where we're at right now.
Okay. All right. Let me see. There's a couple related questions. So Henry is saying documentation on Aspire deployment options for on-premises would be great. And then also related, Marvin Klein support for Aspire support on local IIS. So
so with the first one, to date, as it is right now, one of the things, the Aspire deployment story is very targeted. So we have the only first party inbox solution that we have for deploying using your app host. Like take everything you've written in the app host and then deploy that, is to Azure Container Apps. That's the only end-to-end story that we have. Then there is a community built solution for deploying to Kubernetes and Docker Compose and Helm charts using something called Aspirate, which uses the same mechanisms, like the manifest that gets created from the app host, and then you write an app to interpret that manifest and project it to where you want to go. And we did that on purpose because we didn't want Aspire to be an all or nothing. Like we consciously didn't want it to be, to use Aspire, you have to change your deployment pipeline. Well, that's going to kill it, like from the very beginning. Like you have to be able to adopt Aspire and not change anything about how you deploy. And so what that means, where are the instructions for deploying Aspire on premises? Well, that's different for every on premises. Like we don't have a prescribed way to deploy stuff on premises from Aspire, because the whole intent, the whole purpose is that you just keep deploying your apps the way that you do today. The only thing that is perhaps different, or that you need to consider, is that the values that we inject via configuration, you have to get those values into your app, right? And today there is lots of different ways you can do that. Some people use config files. For secrets, you might use environment variables. If you're running with a secret store in the cloud like Key Vault, you might put them in there. And there are each one of those options has a different set of instructions or choices that you would make about how to do that, which is why there isn't just a how do I deploy an Aspire app on-prem kind of idea. So I would say, hey, again, if you're running on IIS on-prem, then what are you doing today to deploy to IIS? Do that, right? Like are you running on Docker on-prem or containers? Do that, right? If you're running on some VM-based orchestration or Terraform, or you're running on with Octopus Deploy, you deploy today, use that. The only thing that changes between when you weren't using Aspire to when you are using Aspire with regards to deploying on-prem is today you're probably manually setting a bunch of environment variables or pushing config values into settings files as part of your deployment. So that stuff is dynamic and changes per deployment or per environment. That doesn't change. You still need to get those values into the right place that you're learning them from for your environment. And again, there's lots of different ways you can do that. So we can't really prescribe that in one doc. You simply have to decide, do I want to use the app host to drive that, which means you'll update your deployment pipeline as appropriate for you to do so, or am I not going to do that? I'm just going to use the app host for the inner loop. And then you don't have to do anything. Nothing changes with deployment at all. It's the same. So,
yeah, that's a fair point. I think a lot of people think about okay, I'm turning my app into an Aspire app, and now I have to deploy it where Aspire is supported. But it's
really not that. Not yet. I'm not saying there isn't going to be a future where we lean much more heavily into this idea of Aspire is the entry point in all environments, whether you're doing local development, whether you're running on CI and doing testing, or whether you're deploying, or whether you're even running, once you're actually running Aspire somehow is still running there. Those are things that, in the full expanse of time, we very well might make advances there. But as it stands today, the deployment part is completely opt-in, and we only have one supported target right now, which is ACA on Azure. And then Amazon has built a story for their deployment pipeline and provisioning pipeline as well, but that's owned by them. It's not owned by us. So for local IIS, it's kind of similar, right? because of everything I just said, Aspire's primary sort of app that we were targeting initially was very much like you're deploying to container-based environments where you have some type of runtime, and you utilize all the mechanisms to do so. And we targeted ACA as the first one, right, for deployment. But with regards to running locally on IIS, it really comes down to exactly what you mean by that. If you like, when you hit F5 in the app host, you want your ASP.NET Core apps that you're running via the app host to run on IIS Express or IIS. That's something that we just haven't prioritized. We've only had a couple asks for it, honestly, and it typically is for folks who are relying on very IIS specific features, which is just not the majority anymore at the moment, which is why it hasn't been prioritized as yet.
I did get that question. We taught Aspire workshop at VS Live Orlando, and I think that leans a little bit more enterprisey. And so there were a few people that were like, hey, we're not sure how to integrate this into our, and their IIS and internal apps.
Yeah. So like I said, like that part shouldn't change in terms of deployment and where they run in production. But for the inner loop experience, if you're relying specifically on IIS features today in your app, then that will be but as I said, that is by far not the majority of people as far as we understand.
Okay, cool. We're getting some good questions. I'm trying to kind of group them into some concerns. So there's one here on, can you go into why there's a limitation on starting CS projects out of the solution? We have a multi-solution setup and like to include starting that fallback and now starting the EXE.
This is a VS thing. So the limitation is all about how VS works. So VS wants to be in control of everything when you run stuff in VS. Like that's just how it's built. So everything is solution centric in VS. The solution file is a VS artifact. And so VS simply does not let you start projects or debug projects in the same way if they're not part of the solution that's open. It just doesn't work. In fact, you don't even get restore to work properly. If you try and reference a project from another project in VS, and that other project that you're referencing is not in the solution, you'll get a warning emitted in the build that says this will not get restored as part of doing restore. I did some god-awful hacks to work around that in the Aspire samples repo, specifically for the test project, because I wanted the test project to dynamically discover all the other sample projects in the samples repo. But that's a very specific scenario that I was okay making that hack in so that I didn't have to maintain an Uber solution with every sample in it, because that's just not the intent of that repo. The intent is you want to go to the one sample you want to look at, just copy that one, and it has its own solution file and you open it, right? And so I worked around that. But
I think I saw that one also, that repo has like a solution just for Dependabot support.
Yeah, and it still doesn't work very well. So we were actually talking about not doing something other than Dependabot for the .NET part at the moment. We might automate .NET outdated or something like that instead to keep those up to date for that reason. Because it just doesn't work as well for the samples repo. So it is a limitation of the VS stuff. So we had some ideas about how we could potentially work around it, like have the app host called .NET Run. But again, once you're in VS, that just doesn't work the same way. Like if VS is not the one launching the project, especially for things like debugging, then you lose out on features. Even if it's a web project and it's the one that launches the browser, that's where it hooks up JavaScript debugging. It's where it hooks up CSS hot reload. It's where it hooks up browser link. Like all of that stuff won't work if the project is not in the solution file. So it's just a limitation of VS as it stands today.
All right. I think related here, do you have plans for supporting multi-repository solutions? I wish.
Yeah.
So awesome, get repository support.
Loose plan. So it's funny, like before we even launched Aspire, announced it, this question came up internally, and I answer it the same way today as I did back then, which is I see three patterns probably emerging. And again, it kind of comes back to what are you doing? What did you do before Aspire? Like, what were you doing today as part of your inner loop? How did local devs run when they didn't have everything in one repository or one solution? Like, what did they do? What did it look like? Did they have two VSs and they launched one and then they launched the other manually? And if they did in the wrong order, apps would fail. Like, Did they have a PowerShell file that they ran to launch dependencies? Did they have containers? So their dependencies, they didn't build certain services. They just got them as containers, ran those first, and then launched the stuff that they had source for. Do they work against a deployed instance? So like I'm team A, I call team B's service, team B publishes and hosts a dev server instance of their service so that I can dev against that when I'm running locally, because I don't build their service. Like there are so many different patterns of how people do multi-service, like multi-solution things, that coming up with one answer was just seemed short-sighted. So that said, now it's been a year and a bit, we've seen a few patterns emerge. And in fact, someone in the community built a prototype of like, what might it mean to be able to add a Git repo as an Aspire resource? So in your app host, you would say, yeah, add a project, but it's in this Git repo. And then Aspire on launch would do the work to like clone the repo, maybe as a submodule, maybe not, again, depending on what you want to do, and orchestrate building it. But again, go back to what I said about VS just before. Building projects that are not part of your solution is just not something that VS supports well. And so there's a limit to what we can do with regards to what does it mean to work with multiple solutions with Aspire. So I think there are patterns that fall out of it. And we've certainly talked about those patterns with folks in the discussions forum and online and stuff. But with regards to like a first class feature, we haven't got a firm plan yet for what a first class feature and a more prescribed pattern for doing that would be. Right now, it's like, hey, understand, like, learn how it works. Think about how you were doing it before Aspire, and then make a choice based on what you know. What's the right approach here for us? Do we want multiple solution files? Do we want containers being published and factor them in that way? Do we want to use a Standup, a dev resource, and point it that way? Like, you know, do we get submodules? Like, decide what works best for you, and then implement that, and then we'll see where we go in the future.
Okay. All right. So we have to stop before the hour because we have VS Toolbox starting then. So if you see any questions you really want to cover, let me know. Otherwise, here's, I think, a quick one. Is there a preferred way to handle migrations when using Aspire?
This is a very similar answer, right? People often will ask, how do I do X, or what's the preferred way? And often we give the answer of, well, it depends. There are trade-offs. Like I have a way that I tend to prefer, but I don't work on real projects, build real web apps with multiple people on them in complicated companies. Like I just don't do that anymore. I did that 20 years ago. And so the answer is going to be different. So I can say that there's lots of different approaches that have fallen out. A lot of people don't even use migrations, right? They use EF Core, but they don't use migrations. They have a different process for managing their database. What we've done in the samples repo is shown a couple of different ways. The one that I'm most fond of is having a dedicated app that is part of your overall app topology that just manages the database, does nothing else. And you only ever run one instance of that app. It's set up to not scale, doesn't scale up or down. And that app means you can just write C# code that runs migrations. And it also means that from an Aspire in a loop point of view, you can make your other apps in your app host, your other projects, depend on that one if they need the database, so that they wait for that one to finish running every time you in a loop. That verifies that the database is up to date and migrated via a health check before they try and start, meaning that you'll avoid having stuff start and try to hit the database before it's ready. That's the one that I really like using, and we've used that in quite a few of our samples. But other people they like running the migrations from the app host. So they might have a custom command that they've written, or they write code directly in the app host that runs the migration on launch. Other folks use features of EF, like EF bundles, where they want to build an EF bundle actually that runs migrations as part of their deployment pipeline, and then they run that, you know, with the right privileges, and then they do stuff. Like it really depends on a lot of different things. Like you need to choose the one that works kind of right for you. But yeah, my preferred one personally is this pattern of just having a dedicated app whose job it is to verify that the database is up to date and run migrations if they haven't been run yet.
I do like that. I noticed that I picked that pattern up from the workshop, and that seems like a simple, like it's all contained, and it's something you can run on its own and test and reason through. And it
works all the way through to production. So you can have that app in production configured with different credentials to all the other apps. right? Like, so it's a very flexible approach.
Yeah.
And it means that even in production, when you do your deployment, that part gets deployed first. And that doesn't fix like all the standard classic distributed database, migration issues that you have to deal with, like, doing multi-phase schema changes so that the old version of the app can still work with the new version of the database and vice versa. Like, you have to manage all that manually still. None of that stuff is done for you today with EF migrations. That's still a choice that you have to make and factor in. This pattern doesn't solve that, but it certainly allows for it. Like, it doesn't make it so you can't do that. So yeah, I really like that pattern.
Okay, cool. All right, just a few more here. Deployment options with Aspire and Blazor. Can I deploy to Azure Static Web Apps? Should I?
Yes, you can. It's just not a turnkey option. Like, it's not supported by AZD. So if you add a Blazor WebAssembly app to your app host and then run AZD up, it would be amazing if one of the options was that automatically went to Azure Static Web Apps and configured the static web app so that your ACA services that were also deployed via AZD were set up as the back end for that, because that's a feature of Azure Static Web Apps. So all traffic gets routed through Azure Static Web Apps, and then your back end stuff is running in ACA. That's a scenario that I think is really appealing, and I'd love to see us do first class support for, but we don't have it there. So you could do it manually. You just have to do it manually today. You'd have to learn about those features, set up Bicep or whatever it is your AZ scripts or however you choose to deploy to Azure, and you could totally do that. I think that's a great idea. The Aspire dashboard is deployable. It's available as a separate container image, and if you deploy to Azure Container Apps using AZD, we automatically enable the Aspire dashboard for you. In fact, it doesn't get deployed. It's actually hosted by ACA on your behalf. You don't have to do anything else. They just do it for you, and they configure it all correctly so that you still see all the information in the dashboard, at least for the stuff running in ACA. So.
Okay. All right. I'll try and take 2 or 3 more if we can.
Yep.
Let me see. There was one I really liked here. Oh, what? Okay. So why does Aspire require you to have a container runtime installed even if you don't use it?
Shouldn't. So the very, very long time ago, like the first preview, there was a check in Visual Studio, and it would, when you launched Aspire, it would say, hey, you need a container runtime or it's not running. We removed that check like a very, very long time ago before we shipped Aspire 8. And we moved to a model in Aspire 9 whereby the containers don't even, if you have containers in your app host, like you've said, add a container or add Postgres or whatever, add Redis, and that needs a container, we still don't stop you from starting. What happens now is those resources show up in the dashboard with a warning that says the container runtime isn't healthy or it's missing. And then you can go and start it, and then they'll recover. So if you're seeing a message, that says to me that you must have a really old version of Visual Studio, maybe like you're running 17.9 or something. Or 17.
They did say later that they were in Rider, so maybe it's a Rider.
That could be a Riderism. Then Rider needs to make a change.
Okay. All right. So we're pretty close on time. Let me take one more. That's
one more.
Maybe, hopefully just a fun one. Do you use Aspire to build Aspire?
Yeah. No. Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of different, right? Because you're building a.
We don't need to bootstrap ourselves with like a last known good. We don't do that kind of thing like compilers do, where you use the checked-in version of the last known good build of the compiler to build the new version of the compiler. Aspire's not like that. Like Aspire doesn't run as a distributed app itself, so not in that sense. But yeah, people working on Aspire use it every day because they're building it and running it. So.
Awesome. Okay. Well, this was great. I was like, as always, I don't know if we get enough good questions, and we got tons of questions.
Lots of good questions.
Yeah,
we could do this a lot more often. I think we'd still have.
Yeah, I think so. Yep. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Well, I will find the media asset to play us out. Thanks a bunch, Damian.
See ya.